So this section now is getting into some of the statistics on the coronavirus. And as Carl mentioned earlier, there is a lot of issues around measurement, around what is really the incidence of this disease in the population. We're starting to see some preliminary studies coming out saying that, you know, that this 5% mortality rate that you compute when you compare the number of deaths with the number of confirmed cases is, you know, that a 5 times, that would be 5 times or 50 times, sorry, the fatality rate of the flu. On the other hand, you probably have a heck of a lot more people that have this disease or have been exposed to it that are asymptomatic. They do not have symptoms. And we just don't have accurate measures on that because we don't have all the testing that we need. And I'm not a healthcare professional. There's some other kind of testing, not just whether you've got coronavirus, been exposed or not, but also they're looking at antibodies for various purposes. And so there's a lot of developing news going on every day about this. And so we'll talk about some of it in here. And some of you on the phone will know more about this than I do, and I'll be happy to hear you. Please chip in at any time. But you've all seen various.
Dave,
yep.
Pursuant to that, my understanding is that the first set of tests that they've had have enabled hospitals to figure out whether or not somebody who comes in sick currently has an active infection, but will produce a negative result if the person had an infection but got well. So they don't know that you've had it and are over it and presumably have antibodies and can't catch it again for some period of time. The second test, the blood serum one, they're only just now starting to do that. And that one presumably is supposed to not tell whether you've got a current active case, but tell whether or not you have antibodies against it and therefore have had the infection. You could currently have it, but that's not what the test is necessarily telling. You could have had it last year and you got over it. So it's important when they're trying to figure out the fatality rates, because the fatality rate that you're really interested in is what percentage of the people who get it are going to die. You don't know how many people have really gotten it, then you don't really have a real fatality rate. You're sort of guessing at the denominator, and we've got a probably pretty good guess at the numerator. You know, we can count deaths in the hospital, even in spite of my earlier comment about incentives to count things as COVID deaths when they might not be. But you still have an even worse guess at the denominator until we get this testing going. And frankly, from what I've heard, the early testing has indicated that while it's still a very small percentage of the population, it's some testing done on the East Coast, and there was some testing that Stanford did that indicated that there were more people who had antibodies for it than they expected, by like an order of magnitude.
Right, right. No, good points. No, and we'll be talking about some of that because it's developing daily, hourly, some of this stuff. So we use the different version of this graph on page 30 here. Before that, just sort of was the idea of pushing down that pink curve so that the number of cases stays below sort of that healthcare system capacity. And now this graph just adds another idea, which is, you know, expand that capacity. You know, so move this line up. We shouldn't just be trying to push the curve down with like social distancing and other things. We should also be trying to lift that capacity line. And, you know, I think that was a really key point. It's a nice upgrade on this graph. Next one.
Well, on the idea of upping the capacity, it's fairly easy to, you know, for Ford or GM to manufacture ventilators. And so we can go up from the 100,000 full service ventilators and the 160,000 total ventilators we had. It's a lot harder to up the capacity of medical professionals who can successfully use ventilators, which is not like 135,000 people, because it's like a multi-year training program to try and up the capacity of the medical professionals. And so that's going to be our limiting factor in terms of ventilator kind of capacity.
Yeah,
although we do have the ability, if the federal government would use it, of moving the ventilators and the medical professionals around the country to where they are needed. I think
Is that, have you heard anything about that happening, Carl? Are they really, like, I know I've heard they're moving ventilators around. Are they actually moving the teams around, the people?
I know a lot of medical professionals went to New York, and if they were the wrong kind, some of them sat on the sideline. But
Right.
There is such organization, it's called Traveling Nurses, and I read an article in Tribune last week. So they dispatch nurses when they need it. It was even before Corona, so they just, you know, they just send people. So now they're sending people to outbreaks.
One of the sad things about ventilators is even though we've spent a lot of time and energy worrying about them, is that apparently the people who get on them are like an appreciable percentage of them are likely to die even on the ventilator. So you're already very, very serious when you get on the ventilator. And a lot of the stuff I read that predated COVID, in fact, there were even things that were asking whether or not ventilators were all too often not prolonging life, but prolonging dying.
Yeah.
I still think we need them. I think it's great, but I think we had this illusion at some point in the past, not that long ago, that if we could just have enough ventilators that nobody would die. And that sadly isn't the case.
That's very true. And one other part of the emerging science here is that this disease may cause other organ damage that's maybe lifelong or long-term. Something you don't see with the flu, problems, heart problems, or obviously lung problems or liver problems. This thing can hurt your other organs too. But again, it's very early and we don't have all the science in on this yet. There's these studies cropping up bits and pieces. But so as of Saturday, yeah, about noon, I did this slide. And so this database, by the way, is a fantastic source. You can go in there and it's pretty intuitive to slice this data almost any way you want. And they do it with links, so it's not quite like Fred, where you kind of have to know the name of the series and find it. You can just look at the links and be like, okay, I want to know about, like this, it looks like the title. So confirmed COVID cases and deaths, you'll see a link, you click on it, and this graph comes up. All you have to do then is pick which country you want to look at or countries, and it'll put the data in the graph. So I find that source to be useful, and you can see the statistics over here. And as we've talked about, there may be more deaths than we're talking about because apparently some of the people dying at home aren't, they're not testing everybody to see whether they had coronavirus or not, but mostly, as Paul mentioned earlier, it's the denominator that is the challenge of, what's the right one to use? Do you use confirmed cases? Do you do number of tests? Do you use what you think the incidence of, how many people, you try to infer a number of people in the population that might have it based on a typical coronavirus test or based on the serum test? What's the right test? So these are hard numbers, confirmed deaths, confirmed cases, but they may be missing, they may have omissions. There may be reasons they're under or overstated, although very likely in the second one, it's very, the confirmed cases is probably an understatement. If you're trying to do an apples to apples comparison with the flu, which is a 0.1% mortality rate, 1/10 of 1%. This thing's 50 times or so more deadly if you were just use these numbers, but you can't use them yet. So we covered that already.
David, I think this is Jim, one of the statistics that I've seen some people who are trying to make light of this whole issue is they take the confirmed deaths over the total US population and come out with some incredibly small percentage and basically say, what are you worried about?
Yeah. A number that I think is pretty handy is to use the 37,000 here divided by the total number of people that got tested, which is 3.24 million. And the number you get there, 37,000 divided by 3.24 million, is 1.1%, which would be 10 times as bad as the flu. In my gut, that feels right to me, but that's a total back of the envelope number, more or less. I mean, I have no idea. It could wind up being 0.1, just like the flu. It could be, I don't think it's going to be 5. It could be, somewhere in that middle. But the one, I like the 1.1 number. If I were going to be in a debate, I'd try to defend that number before I try to defend 5.2 or 0.1.
It's been
all right.
3% in other countries, 3 or 4%.
Say that again?
It's been 3 to 4% in other countries when they have been farther down the pike.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's like 30 times, and that doesn't include any collateral damage.
Right. Yep. So just as you look at these numbers, just keep in mind that the science around them is evolving.
David, I updated that slide. The confirmed deaths now are over 42,000, and the number of confirmed cases is 784,000.
Wow.
And then the percentage is right at 5.2, 5.3%.
Yeah.
So I just pulled that up from Johns Hopkins.
It's sad. I mean, I don't have the slide here. Some of you that are my Facebook friends have seen it. I mean, 9/11 was about 3,000 deaths, and Pearl Harbor was like 2,400, and we're seeing 3,000 plus deaths a day recently here in April. So it's like we're getting a 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor every day in terms of deaths. So these are the daily changes in those numbers. So you can kind of see the pattern evolving. I don't know where our math majors are on the call. Is this a derivative? Or what's the rate of change in our daily increase in cases or our daily increase in deaths? But
That's the first derivative.
there we go. Thank you very much. So we have our math people. But so if you hear someone talking about a plateau, in cases, you got the prior page, which is still a line that's going straight up. That's the totals, in a 45-degree or higher than 45-degree angle line. And then you can see the change daily in cases, and that's where there's some optimism, at least, that you're seeing this. But again, measurement. One of the challenges on the left-hand side is because our number of tests has been plateauing around 150,000 a day, are we missing out on more cases? Should we be finding a heck of a lot more cases than we found? And then also in terms of deaths, again, are those numbers over or understated because we're not always getting the accurate cause of death for people that died at home? It may not be identified there. So,
What would be interesting would be a chart showing the number of tests per day and how that compares to this, whether that would help answer the question of, is it just more testing and how much of it's more testing?
Yeah. Okay. I'll see if they've got that one on the site. I may take a look there. Okay. Next one. Looking at an international comparison, you can pick whatever country you want and it'll plot it on the scatter plot. So I picked a few of them. We're doing about as well as Europe, it looks like, when you kind of take a quick look at this. This is confirmed cases. Let's see, the vertical axis, confirmed cases per million, and then the horizontal axis is deaths per million. Both are bad. We don't want cases, we don't want deaths. So being in the upper right-hand corner is bad. Like South Korea, Asia is doing quite a bit better. China, because they have that incredibly huge population, and who knows if the Chinese numbers are accurate, but just based on what we have, they're doing better than we are too. So, we're not an outlier in terms of Europe, but we are in a worse shape than some other countries there in the middle, in Asia. I don't trust the Russia numbers at all. I'm very curious to see what happens with those numbers. But I heard the other day, Dr. Birx, Trump's person, she said, the U.S. is doing better than other countries in terms of the death rate or the cases that are growing. I'm not sure I'd say that. I think we're sort of in the pack with Europe, and we're worse than Asia.
Oh, I mean, there's 190 countries in the world, and about a dozen of them are doing worse than us.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yep.
Data never stopped Trump from saying anything.
So while we are not the worst in terms of death rate or cases per million people and stuff like that, there are countries that are worse, including one that you don't have on your graph, Belgium, which is the highest death rate of any reasonably sized country. We're in the top 15 or the bottom 15 or the worst 15 in terms of those statistics. So nothing to exactly be proud about. If you look at our current death rate, oh, what is it? Like 128 deaths per million in population. The world average is 22. So, you know, only being 5 or 6 times the world average death rate doesn't impress me as a really statistic to be proud of.
Yep. Yeah,
It's just me.
those press conferences are kind of wild in terms of what you hear.
So in terms of the conditions that they say make it more likely to be fatal, obviously we've talked about Americans having a disproportionate problem with being overweight and diabetes. Age is supposed to be another risk issue, although I would think Europe would have an aging population too. Wonder how those things affect it too.
This is not adjusted for demographics, so that's a good point. Trying to sort that out is something that you'd want to do if you were to evaluate that in its, you know, in the most precise way.
I think
I think that they emails from the governor's office, and they started including for the last month. They've been including the county and age listings. And if you looked at those, you would believe that there is an age component. Between 2 years and 40, it's very rare to see a death. There was one in today's memo. Above 40, it goes up significantly, and it kind of follows. It goes up much faster than the demographic curve for boomers. So,
And
yeah,
let's look
there's an age.
there's a slide in here on New York. Let's go to the next one, I think. It's not the next page, it's coming up. It'll be up in a second here. So this one was from New York, and it has some of the demographics. To Mark's point, you know, the younger folks are not getting hit anywhere near as hard as that 45 to 75 plus group. Underlying conditions are a big factor. Age is a factor. Yeah, so also the men are getting disproportionately killed off. The share of deaths, 61 versus 40 for women. And I don't have it on here, but African American groups are also getting hit harder than others. And that may be, I don't know that it's necessarily biology as it is the economics and the availability of the best healthcare. But I more to come on that one, but I've heard that it's really hitting that community badly.
Do you want to go back?
Sure.
Okay.
So when you look at, and I guess the other graphs I think are probably easier to interpret for me, but there's the interesting here, they're very faint. You don't see them very easily, but how often are these counts doubling? So confirmed COVID deaths are doubling in the US somewhere around every 3 days. 3 to 4 days. And that's 5, and then the 3 is buried right on that red line, then the 2 days. So, you know, when you're predicting this, and this is where I might need some help from Ed, our modeler, but if we're at 40,000 deaths now, are we going to be at 80 in the middle of next week or the end of next week? It seems like that's too fast. But
Ed, you're on mute.
Yeah, the data that Cuomo was showing for New York showed the daily death rate. I didn't see his report today, but 3 days in a row it's going down. So hopefully that's the direction, and we don't keep going up at that accelerated rate.
yeah, yep, let's hope. But yeah, that it's still around 3 days doubling is pretty frightening. All right, let's go to the next one or skip the next one.
Yeah, on that one slide, you don't really see us really bending over yet, although this is 2 days out of date. Hopefully, like Italy or France, where it noses down, that will happen. Okay,
Yep.
right
let's
here.
hope. Yeah, we saw that one. Here we go. And this is just some comparisons here. And they have a case fatality rate estimate from as best they could. Like Mark mentioned earlier, some numbers in the 3% range. The pros are thinking this will be a 1% to 3.4%, so 10 times as bad as flu to 34 times as bad as flu. And they talk about the different things here. I mean, one of the reasons why this virus was so difficult to contain is because of that incubation time. You know, people were traveling for 2 weeks and they could start to show symptoms. So I mean, it's a very, and meanwhile they were probably contagious in that interim. So it's one of the reasons why this thing was able to spread, you know, in stealth mode for a while before it really hit. So nice comparison there, I think, and that you know, that RO number is how many people does each person affect, and it's not RO, it's R naught, I think is the right way to pronounce it, the R0 or R null or R naught number.
Are not.
R naught, thank you.
Yes.
And that's, you know, if you're infecting 2 or 2.5 people, you're going to get a geometric crazy growth rate like we're seeing. You got to get that down. I would assume, I don't know, it's probably under 1.
Ordinary measles. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Has to be below 1. And what is scary is that herd immunity isn't going to kick in with that kind of a multiplier until somewhere around 80%. So 80%, and let's say it's a 3%, 80% of the population has to be immune. 3% of the people who get it will die. That's 10 million Americans. And that's before this thing stabilizes. So it makes the Spanish flu look pretty mild.
Let's hope it doesn't, but yeah, it's ugly. Let's keep going.
Ordinary measles into an unvaccinated population can be as high as 18 to 19 for the R0.
Yeah, they are not. Yeah, and
Or not.
what they're talking about is you want to get the R naught down below 1.
Yeah.
In terms of getting this contained, so that, you know, for each new case, you have less than 1 new case going forward.
For the engineers in the group, it's like the gain on an amplifier. You want to keep it below 1. Or the feedback, maybe I should say, on the amplifier loop. The other thing that's in the same range as COVID to be scary about, since it still has a very high fatality rate, higher than COVID, is Ebola. It also has an R0 or R naught, if you prefer, in the 2 to 3 range. And as far as I know,
But it doesn't.
Go ahead.
It isn't orally transmissible. It's transmitted with fluid.
Yeah, it
Orally.
But they were claiming it was still spread a similar high degrees. Although I think its transmissivity, I think it was easiest to transmit when a person was showing symptoms as opposed to COVID, where it can easily transmit where there's no symptoms being manifest.
Because they bleed through the ears and everything.
On that note, if we want to spend money on medical stuff once this is over, that might be something to look for a cure for.
All right. The next few pages, I've got some summaries of investigations that are starting. I heard some news that the Government Accountability Office is going to be auditing these things, and I suspect down the road, if we get a Democratic president, we're going to have a commission investigation, I would assume, into this to make sure we do better. I can't say that this never would have affected anybody, but I would hope that we could have been better prepared. So this slide talks about kind of a general summary of some of the main issues that hurt us in this case. It's a good article from the AP, which tends to be pretty neutral, I would think. So there are some interesting elements on the timeline. One of the things I spent a lot of time on last weekend was updating the Wikipedia article on the timeline of the coronavirus crisis. So I'll go through some excerpts from that. I took a whole bunch of different sources and put them out there, and it's out in the world now for people to look at. But when you look at these things, we have to. And there's some complexity, obviously, lots of it. I shouldn't. That's not a good intro. Let's put it this way. With number one, the CDC typically creates its own test. It is not unusual that the CDC did not take the materials that were offered by the WHO at the beginning. We've often not done that. So that not taking the WHO materials in and of itself is not unusual for us. However, we then proceeded to create our own test, which was defective. And I'll get into some more details on how that test was defective. So just be careful if you're arguing with your friends. It wasn't that we were just completely neglected to take the WHO materials. We've often let those go to less sophisticated third world countries, and then we create our own tests. And the CDC's done that very, very well in the past. This time they blew it. And we'll get into some of that, but I won't go through all the others on here. We're going to cover some of them in detail, but this is a good overview of the investigation of the list of issues is in that AP article. Here is some of Trump's more entertaining assertions. And, I appreciate a president that's a bit of a cheerleader, but this isn't really the best time to do that, put it mildly. So he didn't do he has not distinguished himself in terms of his communication throughout this period. And it's at this stage, I think my view is that he's more interested in getting the economy going to help him get reelected than he is in maybe sacrificing a lot more people than we need to when we can be printing money to keep people on the sidelines for quite a while if we need to. But I won't go through all these. You're hearing them in the news every day and shaking your heads, I'm sure.
Hey, David, one thing that was missing from that is on February 27th, when Trump claimed that this whole thing was a Democratic hoax at one of his rallies.
Yeah, yeah, and I've looked at some fact checks on that statement, and I think that's what he meant. I think when you look at it's been a little while since I looked at this. Maybe somebody can help me out here, but he didn't say the virus was a hoax. He said, and I wish I had looked at that fact check lately, but it's not what he said. He said that. Does somebody else remember? I apologize for that. I don't. I'll sneak a look at it a little bit later. I'll try to get it before the end of this meeting when someone else is chatting or asking questions. But be careful with that because he didn't say that exactly. The PolitiFact didn't throw him under the bus for that statement. So for what it's worth, I'll come back to that.
Do you want some bipartisan issues or not?
You can, throw it in. Go ahead.
I became aware of something called the No Ban Act that our House was considering a bill. It looks like 3/5/2020. I just Googled it to remove the power of the president to ban or restrict aliens from entering or leaving the United States as a result of him trying to ban travel from China. So we've got a little bit on our side too.
Well, I would say that by the time Trump attempted to, really raise our borders up, it was too late. I mean, if you're talking about something that happened on March 5th, we had thousands, tens of thousands of cases running around this country at that point. We didn't know it. We hadn't tested for it. We hadn't confirmed them. But I mean, this virus arrived in the U.S. in January. With an R naught above 2, it was spreading. And, closing the barn door at that point really isn't effective. There are lots of things we should have been doing at that point, which would have been effective. Shutting our borders is not really one of them.
Your point is well taken, but again, your point applies to our side as well.
No, this is interesting, and again, this is one of those where there is a lot of debate going on about this one. When Trump did the travel ban on China, and remember it was a partial ban because 40,000 people came here after the ban. What experts were already saying is because you need contact tracing and you need testing, extensive testing, and the ability to do research. Community, there's a term for it. Community. Oh, I wish I were an epidemiologist, but I can't answer that question. But it's it's tracing and community something. But they're researching to figure out where where people that have the virus have showed up. If you've got 40,000 people coming, and if you already have it in your country, then that kind of you can't shut travel down entirely. You still need to do all these other things. So epidemiologists think that travel bans actually are ineffective. Unless you were to be able to get it to be 100% locked down where nobody travels, a partial ban is just not going to cut it. And in many cases, if Trump did this as of the end of January, then throughout January, already, I think they said 300,000 or 400,000 people had already come here. 300,000 people came here during the month of January from China. This thing was already in the population here in the U.S. and it was just fermenting. So I would sympathize in that. I don't think that was the Democratic argument. It was more, hey, this is racist, da da da. It wasn't about the epidemiology of it. But there is that scientific argument that a travel ban just doesn't work. All right. So I looked up. Okay. So I'm looking at the fact check here now. I know you guys can't see this. I just did a search on PolitiFact coronavirus hoax, and it comes up. But he basically says, it's parsing words. It's really hard to. I'll let you guys read it. You can take a look at it and make your own determination. But Trump was careless with his words. He shouldn't have used the word hoax next to a pandemic, among other things. So this one, now this was an interesting slide. Carl shared it on Facebook a couple weeks ago, or a week and a half ago. If you intervene a week or two earlier, because of the geometric growth in this thing, the exponential growth of this thing, you can, according to this researcher, it's op-ed, it's not German, you can dramatically reduce the number of deaths if you had just intervened a couple of weeks earlier. And I'll get into this on the timeline. I think we'll have a lot of interesting discussion around that timeline based on what's already been happening here. But in the middle of January and throughout this process, there have been a bunch of scientists who have been emailing each other back and forth about this coronavirus, and they've been keeping email chains on different subjects, and they call them the Red Dawn emails. They're like the movie Red Dawn, where a group of Americans are sort of become, I guess you would call, from the perspective of the invaders, they would be terrorists, but they were freedom fighters trying to free America of the Russians that have taken over a big chunk of America. And there's an 80s version, which is pretty good with Patrick Swayze. The more recent one is pretty bad. I would skip that one. I'd go back to the original. And you'll be amazed at who's in it. Who's who of famous young actors and actresses in the 80s. But what they said is that by the middle, and I may use my timeline for this, but the middle of February. Wait, let me check this. I need to refer to this because this is a cool story. In the middle of, I believe let me go, hold on a second. Let's go to the timeline for a second. Would you skip ahead just for a minute here? Keep going. Let's go to the timeline for a second. There's a bunch of text. We'll come back for this. Keep going here. All right. Let's see. Hold on a second here. One more page. One more page.
Whoop.
Go one more page.
Holy cow.
I'm sorry, I wanted to cover this here, but all right, so I apologize. You can go back to where we were. The Red Dawn emails are, all these scientists are basically saying that the cat is out of the bag. this virus is now probably in the US, and we're going to have to do testing and contact tracing in order to stop it. And so by the time this travel ban even happens, this is the middle of February. So the middle of February, they've come to this conclusion that it's really too late, that we're done, and that we have to really shut down the economy. They do this. This is the middle of February, and it isn't until mid-March that you hear the governors starting to, lock down the economy. So that in the middle of February, our scientists, and these are the leading scientists. I mean, these are the guys that are the chief scientists at the Department of Homeland Security, and Dr. Dr. Fossey's one of them. He's on the email chains. There's a few others, and they're all talking about this. And they've sort of said, we have to really take drastic measures now in order to contain this thing. And that's mid-February, and it isn't until we get in the middle of March. And that's why when you look at this slide here and you say, all right, we lost that almost a 30-day window before we really did the things we needed to do after the scientists really made their own conclusions and I believe the specific date was actually February 18th when they had asked to meet with the president to go through this with him and say, you need to shut down this country right now. Something else happened. The president got really upset and that meeting was canceled. And there was about a 1 month then interval between when the governors really started to shut things down seriously. And that's where we lost the war. You could argue it even goes back further, but that is a proximate cause, was this disconnect between what our scientific experts were thinking and communicating to each other, and then what we did. It was that mid-Feb to February 18th to the announcements, I believe, from like Illinois was like March 19th or 20th. That is the critical window when we could have really suppressed this thing if we'd acted earlier. And the scientists knew it, but our government didn't want to act, or just there was a disconnect where, this is what happens when you have an autocratic leader who doesn't listen. The scientists had no voice. And I think it would have been very different if a Biden or Obama had been in charge and the top scientists come to him and say, listen, there's not that many cases here right now, but we need to shut this country down now. And they were ready to do that, and they didn't do it. And we'll know why when there's been a proper investigation. But that month is the critical month, I think, that really did us in.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. Now, if we look at the country that handled this the best of all, they did not do it by shutting down. They did it by intensive testing and tracing and isolation. So South Korea has been able to control the virus without shutting down their economy, without asking for social distancing. All they did was do a lot of testing and find the people who have it and isolate them. So we could have done that too, but we didn't have to shut down the economy.
Right, and I think you're right. And that if you go back further, like into January, if we had done the right contact tracing and testing, we wouldn't have faced that decision, which was the shutdown decision in February. I agree. That's correct.
And we would not have millions of people out of work right now.
Yes.
South Korea was very lucky, according to a CNN article. They had a relatively small biotech company that was able to very quickly develop a test for it and churn out bunches of it. Apparently, the rest of the world was not quite so lucky, but things happen, I guess.
Excellent, good points. Let's go to the next slide here. So here's testing progress, and clearly, we weren't doing well back then, and we're still struggling. We're up to about 150,000 tests a day now, and the experts are saying you need somewhere north of 500,000 a day to do this correctly, to really reopen the economy safely. And some of those estimates go into the millions per day. So 500,000 is not a sort of a middle of the bell curve estimate. That's the bottom end of it.
So there's only one country on your list that's doing it. Look at the graph. 500,000. South Korea is the only country that's doing it at that level.
Yeah. And that's where when you hear the president arguing, I want to open up the economy, or the governor of Georgia doing stuff, it's very premature. We're just not anywhere near where those are things that are going to get, if there's justice, they're going to get sued into the Stone Age, which is something else that apparently just dawned on Trump, that there could be liability for companies or governments that open up their economy too soon. Don't ask me why, but that's what you have when you have a guy who's in over his head under these conditions up against.
But yeah,
So
but
we're looking. So when you hear the government saying we're doing 500,000 tests a day, then you might start to change your views about, are we ready to reopen the economy based on the results of those tests? And we're nowhere near that right now. No, what I've heard is the reagent is the main problem. It's not that the labs lack capacity, and that's something Trump's been saying, that the states have the capacity, blah blah blah. It's the reagents. They don't have all the inputs they need to create enough tests right now, is my understanding. All right, let's keep going.
Well, there definitely is a disconnect. I mean, you hear at the task force meetings every day, Trump saying we've got more than enough capacity. The general says we got more than enough capacity to do tests. And during the day, you hear the governors, one after another, saying we don't have enough testing capability. So there's a big disconnect of some type.
And it's about the reagents, is that the Trump and his generals are saying the states have more capacity. It's like, well, yeah, we have more capacity, but we don't have the materials to do the tests. I mean, that's the difference. And I think they're just Trump is just playing with words. And the truth is they can't get beyond 150,000 tests, or you'd be seeing us doing more than 150,000 tests a day. They sort of plateaued.
It's not that he's playing with words. He's just trying to make his truth be true.
So are the reagents made in China too?
They probably are. Yeah, that's a longer term problem. Is we got to get some of this stuff back here, don't we? Either that or stockpile the heck out of it if we don't make it here.
I mean, we can fight over whose fault it is, but the real question is, are we going to fix it?
Yeah, and I don't think we'll fix it under Trump.
I don't think the question today is, are we going to fix it? The question is today, how are we going to stop more people from dying? Fixing it is 6 months down the road.
Right.
Yeah, the cat's out of the bag, so to speak.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. And this one just shows that in terms of when you look at total tests, Trump's been bragging about, hey, we've conducted more tests than anyone else, 3.4 million, but that's not really an accurate based on the population. That's just the number that he throws out there. It's really kind of meaningless if you got 150,000 a day versus the 500,000 that you need. It's just not that relevant a number. But this is another graph that shows that we are in the upper right-hand corner in terms of confirmed cases and also the number of tests, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot unless you divide by the population. So I just put this out here to show a graphic that I wouldn't rely on it too heavily.
Okay. I mean, looking at my source, we're actually, in terms of number of tests per million people, we've actually edged ahead of South Korea at this point, because we're up to 4 million tests. On the other hand, looks to be 30 or 40 countries that have a higher test rate than we do. The leading one is Iceland. We have about 12,000 tests per million people, and Iceland has 126,000 tests per million people.
All right. This slide just shows the situation for supplies at the end of February. It's a great article. You all ought to read it. It's the first one on the list, the National Geographic article on the supplies that are needed. So, our strategic stockpile, we had 12 million respirators and the 30 million surgical masks, and we need a heck of a lot more. One of the estimates said that we could need N95 masks in the billions, not just, hundreds of millions more. So it just gives you a sense of how unprepared we were at the start of this crisis. And, we need enough ventilators for what they were worried about needing them for 960,000 patients throughout the course of the thing. And it's just not clear, is 173,000 enough? Carl mentioned there's different kinds in that 173,000 number. So my understanding though is that as of now we have enough. We relocated some of them, but I don't know for sure.
Well, California and Oregon and Washington shipped a bunch out to the East Coast because they're having their, their peak now. And when their peak dies down, they won't need the peak number of ventilators. They can ship them to the next hotspots. So you can move that 100 to 173,000 population of ventilators around and keep it under control. Again, as I said, it's not just the number of ventilators, but it's also the personnel that know what they're doing.
It might be good to coordinate that nationally instead of letting states.
I think I did a post on that on
Meet with one
Facebook, that if you had somebody nationally doing that, they could, order the equipment moved around efficiently, as opposed to if each state has to stockpile ventilators for their peak capacity, we're going to run way short. Where we
And then when some state like mine goes out of their way to obtain some stuff, and the president says, "Well, you're being unfair to the rest of the country." Come on.
Right. Yeah, the buck stops with the governors, right?
Oh, jeez.
That's as
buck
Truman
stops
famously
anywhere
said,
other
the
than the
buck stops with
resolution
governors.
desk in the White House.
So understand too that this desire to reopen the economy is not coming from economists. Better to stay locked down, okay? And that's what this is a group that there's 40 of them that they surveyed approximately. These are top economists that, you name the university, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Stanford. I mean, these are guys they're surveying. They're all saying, stay locked down. You're not gonna win by, going back to work and everybody gets sick again. That's not your best strategy. Let's keep going here. So the WHO has given some guidelines on when we can go back to work.
The WHO?
Some of these are complicated. Yeah, right. The WHO. Who's on first, as they famously said.
The World Health Organization. Yes.
But there's a list of them here. We've talked. I mean, the most important one, I think, first is that we have to get the testing up and running and know how bad this thing is. And second is we have to get supplies to our hospitals so that people can handle it if there is a surge, that we're not killing all our doctors and nurses off. It's amazing that they continue to go to work even when they are taking these incredible risks. They're really incredibly brave people, like soldiers, that they're going right into the battle. And so there's a list here of them, but we're not really close from a serious perspective. We're close because Trump is trying to force some of his governor buddies to throw his people.
I don't think that's it, because when I look at the numbers, and I've looked at them very closely, sometime in May, community transmission is going to stop for most of this country. And when community transmission stops, there's going to be inexorable political pressure to open up the country. And if we don't have testing and tracing in place when we are forced to open the country by that political pressure, there's going to be a big second wave. So for me, right now, the thing to do is to get the testing and tracing in place, because the steps we're taking right now will cause community transmission to stop within a month.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah, but a lot of countries have taken in China, in the Wuhan, whatever that province is, said, we want no new cases for 14 straight days before we reopen. And we're a long way from that. I hope you're right that we're there in the middle of May. I don't believe it, but we'll see.
Well, by the end of May, we'll be under 100 deaths a day in the U.S. for sure. Right now, the trend line says we'll be there around May 5th.
It's the new cases that I want to go to zero before we reopen.
Well, that's fine. I'm talking about number of deaths.
Okay.
Because we can't measure new cases very well because we don't test very well, but we sure do measure number of deaths more reliably. And the trend line is such that sometime in the first part of May, we're going to be below 100 deaths a day in the U.S. And when that happens, people are going to insist we reopen.
Well, I hope you're right, but with Tennessee and Georgia and Florida and South Carolina
Their,
and
popu-
various
pop-
states reopening now.
their populations aren't that large. They're not going to make a big difference compared to New York and Chicago and Detroit and San Francisco and LA. I've looked at these numbers very carefully, gentlemen and ladies.
Okay.
Let's hope. So there's a list of things that the government also listed. I think there's much more robust stuff out there. They put out a lot of slides and graphs on this stuff, but again, it looks reasonable on paper. I just think the timeline is very optimistic in terms of when they want to do this. All right, let's keep going.
Which slide do you want to be on?
Next one, 46.
Okay.
So, and I'm not going to go through all these, but I took some of the excerpts out of the Wikipedia timeline. They're doing other editors did a fantastic job on the actual main pandemic article, and this one is a link that you'll find as you read the main article. You'll get into this one, but you'll start to see as you go through this, where are these gaps in time when things could have made a difference. So, Ed pointed out that we needed the testing and tracing a lot earlier. I mentioned the Red Dawn emails where there was about a month lag between February 18th and the March 19th and 20th when the states really locked down. I mean, there are these gaps in different things, and you're hearing a lot of peripheral fighting of throwing China under the bus or others. And I just thought the timeline was something that would be helpful. And the New York Times and Washington Post both put out really helpful timelines, and I used that to build this. So if you need a handy list of timelines and links to the articles where they came from, you'll find it in here. But that Red Dawn email one, when you come across that, is really fascinating of this disconnect. And I'm an auditor for an organization, so I'm always amazed when we find problems that somebody always knows, and they don't raise their hand when they should, or somebody doesn't listen to them the way they should, or there's an environment created where people are afraid to raise their hand because they're going to get in trouble. And I spend a lot of time talking to people about, and also creating meeting structures and other things where people feel free to raise their hand. And I sit in those meetings with the executives and I counsel them privately that, make sure your people feel comfortable putting the risks on the table. And, this is the kind of thing when you have an autocratic guy who doesn't listen, that this is the kind of stuff that happens where they don't want to hear bad news. And, in this case, it's incredibly damaging. And he's going to spin it every which way he can. His followers will believe whatever he says. You can't stop a third of the population from believing Trump as a savior, but the rest of us can make sure we understand, and so that doesn't happen again. And this is a nice reference to have of who knew what when and who was saying what when. If things are missing, send me an article and say, hey, Dave, can you add this to the timeline? I absolutely will. And I'll be watching it too as things happen. But it's very well developed. I think pretty well developed for January, February, March, and still needs some work in terms of April, May. There's some other people that just love to indicate statistics by state. And so there's a lot of clutter as you get into April. And I think we'll see that in May too. But as you look at the causes they get in the January, February, March are very interesting, and has a chunk of that in there. So enjoy that. I won't go through all of it here. We're after 9 o'clock, so